I think there are a number of different ways in which targeted sanctions can complement mediation efforts, although, as I said yesterday, we're in the beginning of conducting very detailed research on the subject, so these are really just preliminary observations or suggestions, I think, of ways in which the application of targeted sanctions could complement the activities of mediators and other actors trying to resolve armed conflicts. And one way, the most direct way, is the way in which either the threat of sanctions, perhaps the application of them, the promise of possible suspension of sanctions, any one of these could provide an incentive to mediators, a kind of incentive they could use to persuade people to come to the table, to persuade people to sign an agreement, to persuade, and actually, as I think they're often applied in a very direct way, to deter spoilers from disrupting a negotiated settlement. So there are ways, and you can use the instrument of individual targeting. You can actually target an individual, you can target a political party, you could target, in some cases, even a corporation that's providing material support. And that's a way directly that you could actually apply sanctions to support a certain type of mediation, I think a manipulative mediation rather than a more facilitative, more hands-off type. That's the first way. A second way, and we've seen some examples of this, is the way in which you can use sanctions to try to drive a wedge within a group, perhaps a non-state armed group or a political party, and identify someone who you think is interested in breaking with the leadership and might provide a basis for an alternative voice or a way of including them in a peace process or negotiations. And that would be a second way in which you apply sanctions, or you have them, let's say, on a group ruling, a ruling government, but you lift the sanctions selectively on one or two individuals who might be willing to challenge or participate in a coalition government. And one recent application, or not so recent, 2009, when there was an effort to try to lift sanctions on some of the Taliban in order to persuade them to consider entering a coalition government with the government in Kabul. So that's a second way in which sanctions can be applied, in this case can be lifted selectively to drive a wedge or to try to create a faction that's willing to engage in negotiations that breaks away from more hardline resistance to it. A third way in which sanctions can be applied and contribute positively to a peace process or mediation would be a more indirect way, rather than providing these direct incentives to participants, indirectly affecting the material resources available to one of the conflict parties. And this is something we've seen in a number of the African conflict cases where the United Nations has had or has applied commodity sanctions on a group, or on a perhaps even on a country, knowing full well that the sale of these commodities is a principal source of the conflict or financing for one party to the conflict. And that's a way indirectly of changing the balance of power, the balance of forces, the material resources on the ground, which in theory could create a situation of mutually hurting stalemate and the possibilities for a conflict that's ripe for resolution, to quote the famous phrase about, Bill Zartman's phrase about a conflict mediation possibility. So that's a more less directly applying the incentives, but indirectly affecting the nature of the conflict. There's, fourth and finally, one other way, I think, they provide, at least in the conflict environment, perhaps for larger or longer term reconciliation and peace building. And this was something that I learned through participation in an ARIA formula meeting of the UN Security Council just 10 days ago, in which several ambassadors from African countries that had been subject to UN sanctions for a number of years made reference to the fact that the presence of sanctions sent a very important signal domestically to people that certain types of activity, certain types of behavior would not go with impunity. Certain types of practices engaged in by either warlords, non-state armed groups, rebel factions challenging government forces, that there was some form of accountability, saying that the sanctions sent an important signal. And this is something that I hadn't thought about before, because the signaling aspect of sanctions is not studied as adequately, I think, as the coercive or constraining aspects of sanctions. But it was very interesting having ambassadors from countries that had been under sanctions for 10 years or more coming to this conclusion about the beneficial way. So I think there are quite a number of ways that they can be complementary, but we'll know much more about this 18 months from now when we've actually finished our research on the subject. Well, SanctionsApp, the idea for creating SanctionsApp came from a Swiss diplomat who suggested fairly far into our research in the Targeted Sanctions Consortium, around 2012 or so. She suggested that we consider developing an app as one of the products to disseminate the work of the research that we were doing. And the app itself began with a very narrow focus. That is, we were really only looking at, it has a political purpose behind it in some ways, in its origin. It was intended to be a tool for the elected members of the UN Security Council. The idea that we all know that, of course, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council have the veto. That's an important aspect of their power at the Council, but they also have continuity, year after year, decade after decade of continuity on the Security Council. And this gives them expertise. We've learned from our research on UN targeted sanctions that something like 80% of them are written by the US, France, or the UK. The P5 tend to be the so-called pen holders, those who draft the initial drafts of the resolution. Well, if you're writing the resolution, writing the document, you're actually in a privileged position in terms of shaping the content of that particular document. And when you talk to elected members of the UN Security Council, what you find is that they have a very, very steep learning curve when they first arrive on the Council. And many of them don't realize how much of their day-to-day, week-to-week activity is engaged with chairing sanctions committees, attending sanctions committee meetings, interviewing, meeting with panels of experts, talking to SRSGs associated with the different regions and different conflicts, and talking to the countries involved in the region and in the immediate neighborhood of the sanctioned parties. So they don't realize how much they're going to be doing on sanctions, so there's not really very much training for them on this. So the idea of creating SanctionsApp was to take this body of information that we gathered on all 25 UN targeted sanctions regimes since 1990, and to make the material accessible to just 10 countries at a time. Of course, 5 come on every year, so over time there are more countries that are potentially exposed to it. But we initially created it to put information in the hands of diplomats of the elected 10 members of the UN Security Council. We know we can't level the playing field, but at least to make it a little bit more even. And it's based on a very simple idea: knowledge is power. Access to knowledge, access to information increases the capacity. If you have it easily at your disposal, you can actually be sitting in a meeting and you can take out your mobile device and you can, if a resolution has been tabled and you think there should be some adjustments to it, the app has, in the first menu of the app, alternative language. If you wish to propose a set of exemptions, or if you wish to propose a delay in the start of a sanction, or if you wish to have a review in a certain year. If you just manipulate the app, you go through the types of sanctions, types of adjustments, scope limitations, you can immediately get language that the UN Security Council has used before in other resolutions. And that then gives you, well, could we try this? This was used in the resolution on country X 5 years ago. Immediately, you've got a basis for participation. And that's just one of the menus of the app. The other menu actually has information on our qualitative database. The entire qualitative database is available in the second menu of the app. And this gives you access to information about different countries, the country regimes, the history of the regimes, how they've evolved, how they've changed over time, the different types of sanctions that have been applied. So immediately if someone, let's say a permanent member of the council, makes an authoritative statement and you think that might be wrong historically, you can check on SanctionsApp, and hopefully we have our facts right and we have the right information there. And you can say, well, no, that wasn't really the experience, and there were these unintended consequences, perhaps we should think about that. So that's a second way in which it's intended to be empowering. It's actually quite consistent with Switzerland's support for the idea of reform of the UN Security Council along with the like-minded states, but also with the accountability, coherence, and transparency group. So it's very consistent with a long-standing Swiss foreign policy goal to try to reform the UN Security Council in a modest way.